World War II is one of the more interesting and popular historical conflicts for people to discuss, especially in America. Now, we in America have generally been safe from past conflicts, having actual battles on our soil. And when you think about it, we really only have the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War all taking place on U.S. soil. However, there have been minor engagements on U.S. soil in other wars, such as in World War II. We know we have the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, which resulted in the U.S. then declaring war on Japan. However, following Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked the coast of the United States in what is now known as the Bombardment of Ellwood, California, which was the first attack on the North American mainland during World War II. Hello everybody, my name is Adam, and this is the U.S. History Unlocked podcast, where we look into historical events, people, places, and facts that relate to the United States. If you ever have anything you'd like discussed on the show, feel free to leave a comment, and we may very well look into it in a future episode. But let's get into today's topic, which is on the Bombardment of Ellwood, an attack on the U.S. mainland. So before we get into the attack itself, we need to start off with some background before the attack. It goes back to the attack on Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor took place on December 7th, 1941, and after that, the day after, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and then Japan sent 7 submarines to patrol the west coast of the U.S., and this is around 5,000 miles east of the country of Japan. Now, in December, these submarines sank 2 merchant ships and damaged some other ships, and also came into minor skirmishes with the U.S. military. And this is something that people might not know, that during World War II, Japanese submarines patrolled the west coast of America, and German submarines patrolled the east coast of America. Now, tensions were obviously very high after December 7th, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and there were false alarms all the time along the west coast cities, where U.S. citizens thought Japanese aircraft were heading their way. Blackouts were issued in cities on both the east and west coasts. If there was an attack, it would make it difficult for the enemies to see the area. Now, there was a lot of debate after the attack on Pearl Harbor if Japan would attack the west coast from the air or from the sea or from both. Now, we know today that Japan, they never launched a major attack on the continental United States, but they did have minor attacks, the first of which was the Bombardment of Ellwood. Now, these Japanese subs patrolled the west coast throughout the month of December, and then they went back to Japanese-controlled waters to resupply. And one of these subs was known as I-17, and this was 365 feet long. Now, to put that into perspective, U.S. submarines during World War II maxed out a little over 300 feet long. So this was around 50 feet longer than any other U.S. sub during World War II. Now, as we move forward to February of 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, and this allowed for the internment of Japanese Americans. He officially signed this on February 19th, 1942, and then he prepared to give a fireside chat, which was very common of him, a few days later on February 23rd. And around 70 million Americans tuned into this speech by FDR. And FDR, throughout this fireside chat, he discussed the war and the challenges that America faced. But while FDR was talking, Japan finally attacked the United States mainland on the west coast. So now we're brought to the bombing of Ellwood, which took place on February 23rd, 1942. So Ellwood, California, it's in the Santa Barbara area, and at the time it was home to a very active oil field. Now there's a story that originated a couple decades after the attack, that the Japanese commander of the submarine at the Bombardment of Ellwood had stopped at the Ellwood oil field on a merchant ship prior to World War II. And the story goes that there was a ceremony that welcomed the crew to the oil field, but the commander fell on a cactus and supposedly needed cactus spines removed from his posterior. And being embarrassed, the commander vowed to get revenge. But this story is probably not true at all, because the commander spent his entire pre-war career as a submarine crew member. He was never a commander of a merchant ship. But nonetheless, back to the attack on Ellwood. So at around 7 p.m. on the 23rd of February, this I-17 sub stopped along the coast of the Ellwood oil field. And then the first shells were launched from the submarine at around 7:15 p.m., and the oil refineries were the main target of the shells. So overall, it's estimated that anywhere from 10 to 20 shells were launched by the submarine. The Los Angeles Times, the day after, reported 16 shells were launched. Most probably were short of land and fell into the sea. Some also failed to explode. And overall, only rigging and pumping equipment were damaged, as well as a pier suffering very minor damage. So the shelling lasted only around 20 minutes long, and then the I-17 departed and left for Japan while it was still surfaced. And since this attack was in the evening, around 7 to 7:30 p.m., most of the oil field's workers had already left for the day. However, there was still a skeleton crew at the oil field, but they actually initially thought that the exploding shells were due to internal explosions. Now, one of the workers eventually spotted the I-17 off the coast, and other civilians in the area also noticed the submarine. There's a story of an owner of an inn who saw one of these shells fly over him. He called the sheriff, and then the sheriff told him that warplanes were on their way. However, no warplanes ever arrived, and it's unknown if the sheriff made that up or if he actually had word that warplanes were on their way. So the last sighting of the I-17 off the coast was at around 8:30 p.m., but again, the shelling, it only really lasted for 20 minutes long. So we have the shelling of Ellwood oil field. Again, very minor damage. Nobody died. And this actually ended up being Japan's furthest attack made on a land target during World War II. Again, it was over 5,000 miles away from Japan. Now, Japan only wanted to really instill fear into the American people from this attack. And it's actually kind of surprising to see the mixed reaction of Americans after this bombardment of Ellwood. As we mentioned before, there was much fear that Japan would attack the West Coast, and tensions surrounding a potential attack were high. We have these false alarms where people thought they were being attacked, but they actually weren't. So again, people are always on edge that the West Coast would be attacked. However, the day after this attack, the Los Angeles Times dismissed the bombardment as a hurried and nervous nuisance raid. The Los Angeles Times really downplayed this attack. However, it did seem like the public overall was panicked by the attack, as this and future incidents made more and more people move inland. And then it also caused people to believe that Japanese Americans on the shore aided the submarine. People claimed that they saw suspicious lights from the shore during and after the attack, which people claimed were Japanese Americans communicating with the submarine. So this also contributed to the support for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. After the attack, 4 Japanese Americans and 1 Italian American were taken into custody on suspicion that they were complicit in the attack. Now, interestingly, the day after the bombardment of Ellwood, this was known as the Battle of Los Angeles, a much more notable event that you might have heard of, where people thought Los Angeles was being attacked by Japan, although nothing actually happened in reality, but it's a much more notable event. So that's the bombardment of Ellwood. Again, a very minor altercation, but it was the first attack on the United States mainland during World War II. Now, throughout World War II, Japanese subs continued to patrol the west coast of the United States, but they were only able to sink a couple more merchant ships throughout the entirety of the war. There were also a few other minor incidents, like the one in Ellwood, such as some in Oregon, but these amounted really to nothing, where Japanese subs would again shell the west coast. Now, the location today of the bombardment of Ellwood is actually a golf course, but there are some monuments along the golf course that commemorate the bombardment, and one of the exploded shells was actually recovered after the attack, and that unexploded shell is, I believe, still on display at the Carriage and Western Art Museum of Santa Barbara, which is pretty cool. But overall, that's it for today's episode. The bombardment of Ellwood, a lesser known event of World War II that took place directly on the continental United States. Usually when Americans think of World War II, we again think of it something that's foreign to us, something that took place far away from us. But there were, again, Japanese subs patrolling the West Coast and German subs patrolling the East Coast during World War II. That's all I have for today. Thank you all for listening to the first episode of US History Unlocked. As always, if you have any ideas, any events you'd like discussed, please feel free to let me know, and we may look into them in a future episode. With that being said, I'll see you all here again next week.